thank you that we get to grow closer to you in study. I pray that as we go through this experience, our quality of life may see the benefits that you've said we shall receive. I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. We last met together almost 2 weeks ago now. And we began exploring the topic of conditionality under the Old Covenant. And the reason why we were doing that was, in my mind, that's one place to start explaining how we get to an understanding of salvation. And so when we spoke in our last study, there were two concepts that I spoke about: status and capacity. The status of a person. Apologies, I need to turn off something on the whiteboard. Give me a moment. So we were talking about status and capacity. And the idea that I wanted to take away from that is that a person's status can be granted or changed in a moment, but capacity can't. It has to develop over time. And where we ended was describing the reclassification of formerly enslaved people from a slave to a child, and that recategorization needs to happen before a mind can catch up with that change. So today we're going to recap that last thought because we didn't get to finish it. And then we're going to try and trace this idea of conditionality through different, we can call them dispensations. Different worlds to show how this mechanism, conditionality, looks in different places, specifically, and how it's brought us to the LIO. the world we're living in right now. So as we go through the various steps that we will go through, what I'm hoping that you all take away from this isn't necessarily the conclusions that we come to, but a way of thinking to help you build your own conclusions. So to recap this idea of status and capacity, I call them status and capacity, but terms that we're more familiar with, status being the change of a legal status, that happens in an instant. If you were with me in person, I would ask you what term we would use normally to describe this. When we think about the steps of salvation. And the term I hope that's come to your mind is justification. Justification being the change of legal status from a sinner to a saint, and the moment that it's granted completely. There's no partial justification. And capacity, therefore, which is the slow rebuilding of that actual capacity, rebuilding of understanding, growth in that understanding, and getting better at the ability to live out what's legally true. This can't happen in an instant. It has to grow through time. We could say it's a work of a lifetime. The term that we've used to describe that is sanctification. So when we think of that formerly enslaved person's legal status, once they become free, that status can change with the stroke of a pen. But their capacity to live as a free person to live as an equal can't change in that instant. So when we compare the two and bring them next to each other, what I've called status, which is justification, that happens in an instant, whereas sanctification, capacity, that's gradual. Where one is about the change of a legal status, the other is about the development of character or judgment. One gets rebuilt over time, and the other is granted completely once it's granted. One can't be partial, and the other one can't be rushed. So when thinking about this mechanism, we tried to understand the method that God would use to rebuild that capacity. And the two options that I proposed were force or use external consequences. And when we think of which one is appropriate, we could rule out force because of the very principle that's trying to be taught. Equality. And if you're going to teach equality, the antithesis of that, the complete opposite of that, is that you can't impose your will on someone else. Which leaves this idea of conditionality or external consequences. Where if you tie those consequences tightly enough to behavior, someone's life can be shaped without that person requiring to understand why. So it will appear like a silly example. In Leviticus, chapter 19, the law would insist that a person uses honest weights and measures in the market when they're doing transactions. We can think, yeah, obviously, because you need to be fair. But God had to make it explicit that those Israelites don't use different weights for Israelites in comparison to foreigners. So when we think about Leviticus and that story of weights, what God is asking those merchants isn't for them to have a philosophical grasp of why a foreigner's standing matters. That it matters as much as his own. All they're asked to do is make sure that that scale reads the same number no matter who's standing in front of the merchant. And it's folded into that whole blessings and cursings structure that we read in Leviticus. Which covers whether the community will flourish or not. If you cheat consistently, then the consequences arrive consistently. Deal honestly with everyone, and the blessings flow in. We could go through different examples, but the premise is that conditionality under what we've termed the Old Covenant is necessary rather than just being a convenient tool. That's a recap of this idea of conditionality and consequences. And conditionality. And where we ended was this change in status. Because it explains why the mechanism we've just described gets applied the way it does throughout the Old Testament. So if we think about those formerly enslaved people, that slave mindset as a people, the relationships that they see with authority is hierarchy, and they can't envisage a relationship with an authority figure as equal. And the worth that they have as beings is located externally, which means that for them, in viewing themselves as worthy or not worthy, is dependent on what that authority figure determines. And under this whole framework, fear is the primary motivator of behavior. So if we compare that to a child, from the outside, they look very similar. That same non-consultation behavior between the master and the slave is typically how parents treat their children, waiting to be told what to do. But the main difference when we compare and contrast them is that the objective for that child is that they grow. So that conditionality or those consequences, the premise is that that child grows and becomes an adult one day. On the equal standing as the adult that's developing them. Where that slave is never given the room to grow. So that's where we left off last time. And what I said I wanted to do today is trace this idea of conditionality through time. This isn't going to overlap with those 3 lines of Old and New Covenants that we've done. It's just one linear story with different examples that I've chosen to use. So we can start with the story of Job. Before there is any nation in the way that we describe Israel, before there's any codified laws, we can see this pattern of conditionality in the world that Job lives in. So in the story of Job, it starts off by naming him as blameless and upright. In reference to his character. And in the same breath, it lists his enormous wealth. Because it is shaping the world that Job lives in. It's all his children, all his livestock. He's called the greatest man in the East. So the story places these 2 facts side by side on purpose. Because that's the assumption that everyone shared in Job's world. That righteousness and flourishing were married. That they belong together. Job himself lives in this assumption. Early on in that story, he goes and offers sacrifices on his children's behalf. Just in case they sinned without knowing it. Because in his mind, wrongdoing is what brings ruin. So we'll come back to the story of Job tomorrow. But if we fast forward in time to the formalization of this people at Sinai, and we can see the same shape and how it scales up to an entire nation. We've gone through the blessings and the cursings in past studies. But this is where they're spelled out exhaustively. So, rain in its season, or receiving a full harvest, safety from enemies, and receiving honor from the nations around them. These are the benefits that Israel would receive if they behaved properly. And it's framed this way because of what we described in our intro. That right behavior had to be tied so tightly to flourishing that a whole people wouldn't miss it. So the thing that the blessings are going to be centered around is the land and the fact that it's a nation. So if we strip those two things away, we could think or expect that this mechanism stops, that this structure just dies away. But the Israelites go into exile, the Babylonian exile, and their king, their sovereignty is taken away. Their land is taken away. which means no harvest to bless or withhold. No king, no temple, no army. And so no national honor to gain or lose. All the things that the blessings and cursings that were described at Sinai in relationship to are taken away. But after the exile, that same framework or that same thinking still shows its face. Because now it moves into the realm of right belief or right practice. So the beliefs that those Israelites would have or the practices that they do they become the new area of blessings and cursings. So if you get the doctrine correct, then you're blessed. You're inside that inner circle. You get to be part of the people. If you get it wrong, then you're cursed and you're kicked out. This period post-exile, during the exile, is what creates the scribes as we understand them. And the Pharisees later down the road. And so scribes and these religious teachers end up taking the place that weather and armies took in the Sinai framework. So in their belief system, in that world post-exile, this underlying shape doesn't change. Of obedience leading to flourishing, and wrongdoing leading to ruin. But in both of these cases, the thing that stayed constant, the thing that this behavior didn't secure, is that status. Because it was changed in an instant and couldn't be changed by behavior. The blessings and cursings, the conditionality, was always targeted at the capacity, not the status. After 34 AD, when the gospel spreads, and Christianity takes a hold in the world, that idea of being part of national Israel, that ethnic group, gets destroyed. So what we want to try and identify now is how that mechanism showed its face in a different world. And just like with the scribes and Pharisees, that idea of right belief gets someone in the inner circle, the community of faith, which in theory was open to anyone in a way that it wasn't in relationship to Israel. But still, if you had the right beliefs, then you could be part of the Christian community. And be blessed by all the riches that Christianity would offer. Reminding us of what the reformers pointed out during that period, that conditionality didn't secure anyone standing before God. So these are 4 different worlds which we've skimmed through to try and show this pattern and how it's grown or developed over time. Where it survives losing land, losing nationhood after the exile, and to get to Christendom, this mechanism survives losing an ethnic boundary. So the major test of this mechanism, this idea of conditionality, blessings and cursings, you'd think that if we lose God's name, lose the idea of a deity, then the world would just stop thinking in the framework of blessings and cursings. But in 1798,
Ale v roku 1700...
sorry, I can hear other translators. I think it's Slovak.
Yeah, but these are very big.
So in 1798, the world is going to start secularizing. And this idea of deity shaping life starts getting chipped away at. And so you'd expect that these blessings and cursings fall away as well. Nation states start developing through that period when Christianity spread. Christendom kept the religious language that it used. But this step in going to nation states where nations start becoming sovereign in and of themselves with boundaries, borders, and the world starts getting filtered into people inside those borders and outside those borders. The nations start organizing around citizenship. So these countries get defined by the laws that they hold and the citizenship that they can give out. Instead of in previous ages where it was religious identity. As soon as these nation states rise up with their borders, then the world just turns into citizens on one side and your allies, the citizens being the allies, and everyone else being the enemies. Nationalism, national honor, and prestige of belonging within certain boundaries take the place that blessings and cursings used to hold. Because as these nations went to war with each other, whose nation is winning and whose is losing, who was respected on the world stage and who was humiliated, just became the new vocabulary of blessings and cursings. Politicians today and in the past would describe a nation's rise and its place on the world stage as being because of how good or bad that nation is. Which brings us to the liberal international order. And what was built after these global world wars? When countries that were involved had to figure out how to live next to each other without going into another world war, without World War III taking place. And so those two shifts we've spoken about in 1945, where the LIO, will say, is birthed, but goes into effect when the Soviet Union collapses. That presented a world where this former nation, the Soviet Union, can now get invited into the inner circle. It builds this shared international system. Those trade agreements, the military alliances, etc. Those various institutions that make up the LIO. They're all built around one idea. That the nations that sign up to this order are expected to live by it, and if they live by the order, they benefit. So they get access to this global market that the LIO built. They get protection from bad actors. They're blessed. And so before this, the meaningful line was the border of your own nation. Before this system gets created. Is that nation strong, self-sufficient? Can it defend itself? That was pre-LIO. Post-LIO, that meaningful line becomes something different. Now it's, are you inside the system or are you outside the system? Countries that join and play by the rules opens its markets to everyone else in the system. They benefit. They get better trade terms, better tariffs. A seat at the table. They get to be part of this inner circle. But if you refuse, or you get pushed out as a nation, then the opposite happens. You receive sanctions, isolation, and cut off from the benefits that everyone else gets to enjoy. Blessings and cursings. Given the conditions that the LIO sets up. We've described the LIO as the mature phase of the Old Covenant. Maturity implies sophistication. So everything that the Old Covenant was built on, we should be able to identify it in its mature phase under the LIO. So if we think about this idea of conditionality and blessings and cursings, and how it's become more sophisticated over time, we should be able to see this period that we're in now, this world, new world, as the most sophisticated form of conditionality. Each of these earlier phases there was someone attached to the shaping of that mechanism. So if we think about Sinai, it was God who determined the blessings and cursings, or the king, when the scribes and the Pharisees get created after the exile. And that priest interprets the blessings and the cursings. Or the Pope. And once nation states start developing before an LIO, there's still something that orchestrates this mechanism. Whether it's a person or a government, you could still point to it and say, they decided it. Decided the blessings and the cursings. But this version, under the world we're living in today, is more sinister. Is because it doesn't work the same way. If you ask yourself the question, who's running the LIO? Or who ran it? Past tense. Wasn't a king. It wasn't a single government. So not a king. Not one singular government. As much as different governments could have more sway in the LIO, as much as more prominence, it was a complex system that was run by a group of people. We can There's a alert going out in the UK about wildfires. Give me a moment. So to everyone else in the UK, I hope you're safe. So we were trying to identify who runs this LIO. This order. A term that I'll use is technocrats, which simply means the people whose authority comes from their technical expertise. Not necessarily from being elected or appointed by divine right. Examples of technocrats: economists, or your central bankers, or those various trade negotiators between nations. The whole appeal of this system run by technocrats is that when it was being built, was that it wasn't going to be one more version of one powerful person deciding everyone else's fate. It was going to be neutral, rules-based, above politics, and run and supported by people with the technical expertise to back them up. That sounds beautiful to me. It should sound beautiful to you too. But there's a side effect to this. So if you think about a government, a society, and the relationship between the two. So here's your government. Here's your society. By society, I just mean the people. If you were to ask a technocrat about the trade deals that a government is going to make, with another government, ask them what's the best thing to do in this trade deal. Is it a good idea? They're not going to answer the way a king would. A king would say, it serves my interests. Or, I believe it's just, so I'm going to do it. Instead, by a government seeking the advice of someone with technical expertise, the answer they receive is shaped in the same way an engineer would answer whether a bridge is a good design or not. What I mean by that is that the question at hand, the problem, becomes an efficiency problem. Something that can be answered through technical deliberation. But questions like this about trade kept getting thought about under the premise of technical expertise. And weren't viewed as moral or political questions. What I mean by moral and political is questions where people could disagree about values. So these type of questions that could have a moral answer or should have been supported by moral debate get treated as technical instead and only. A hypothetical question. How much inequality should a society tolerate? If I were to ask you that. In one corner, You have a group of people that believe that this is a moral question that people can genuinely disagree about. In another corner, the question gets reframed as technical. Answered by economists that calculate the effect on GDP in a country. Gross domestic product, a measure of how well a country does economically. Apologies for the acronym, I forgot. Yeah. So notice what this does to this group of people. Over time, they're excluded from these questions. Because politics is what ties the society, the people, to the government. But this system that we're describing, the LIO, said, let's not determine our solutions through politics. Let's get the experts to decide. So when your factory workers living in the USA sees their industry being shipped to other nations, the question that's not asked is, what do we owe someone who's had their whole life change? Because of globalization. Instead, it's treated as a question of how can we most efficiently retrain these people? And so under this system, over time, policy that nations decide on are framed as smart or efficient instead of in collaboration with the public to decide what is just and fair. And so debate dies amongst the people because all these questions that would and should have real disagreements about values get reframed as calculations with a supposed correct answer. If you just get the right expert in the job. So the cries that this isn't fair for my community which were political cries or moral cries, are met with technical, I'll call them non-answers. Like globalization shows that net welfare increases overall. Instead of addressing the cry from the person making the cry. We'll describe more of this mechanism tomorrow. That have led us to the place that has surfaced the necessity for this mechanism to die. In comparison to earlier versions of this method or mechanism, however harsh it may have seemed, could at least be named for what it was. Someone was deciding those blessings and cursings. You could argue with them. You could resent them. You could resent God. You could even rebel against them. Hello? Rebel, like rebellion. But a system that believes that it's neutral doesn't have a framework for noticing when it's still running the exact same blessings and cursings. Underneath all that language used by your technocrats. It doesn't experience itself as rewarding winners and punishing losers. It just looks at us as a system that produces results. So we're out of time. I'll recap briefly. In recapping my recap, in our study 2 weeks ago, we described two ideas, status and capacity, and I gave them theological names today. Justification, sanctification. But the key takeaway from exploring those two ideas is that one happens in an instant and doesn't change. That's your status. Going from slave to free. and the other is the capacity to live as a free person. To live as an equal. That has to be rebuilt. And the mechanism to rebuild that capacity is to frame right behavior around external consequences. To try and teach a principle. And so I went through different, I'll call them worlds. The world of Job, Sinai, exile, and then Christendom, to show how this mechanism has changed its costumes or its clothes to adapt to the world that it's in. Which brings us to, I'll say, the focus of my study. Which is, how does this mechanism work under the mature phase of the Old Covenant? When there's no more king, there's no more God to attribute those blessings and cursings as coming from. Instead, we have a system run by technical experts. And so when we meet tomorrow afternoon, we want to explore that despite this being the mechanism that God uses, it had side effects. And those side effects lead us to a point where that mechanism is no longer fit for purpose. Once capacity has been reached. So we can close there with a word of prayer. Dear God, I appreciate that you've been faced with difficult choices you've had to make throughout history. But as I'm learning, as we are learning, our standing with you has never been in question. And I thank you for that categorization switch that you did many years ago. So that we could grow from children to adults. And be your equal. I pray thanking you in Jesus' name, amen.